You stand before the gates of a house that does not wish to be found, and yet here you are, watching the iron twist and part like reluctant lips preparing to speak an uncomfortable truth. And you realize that some stories begin not with a birth, but with a bloodline so ancient and so deliberately preserved that the child herself becomes almost incidental to the weight of names written centuries before her first breath. The year is 1951, and somewhere in the hidden corners of wizarding Britain, in a bedroom draped with velvet so dark it seems to drink the candlelight, Bellatrix Black enters the world screaming, which, you might note with a gentle smile, she will continue doing with remarkable consistency for the next 4.5 decades. You feel the chill of the room despite the roaring fire, because the noble and most ancient House of Black has always valued appearances over comfort, tradition over tenderness, and the delicate art of making house guests feel vaguely unwelcome over anything resembling hospitality. The Black family, you learn as you drift through these early memories, traces its lineage back to the Middle Ages, claiming descent from the same era when Britain's actual aristocracy was busy establishing the very concepts of primogeniture and entailment that would govern inheritance law for centuries. A mainstream historical fact that reminds you how obsessed humans have always been with controlling what happens after they die, as if the grave were merely an inconvenient pause rather than a full stop. You notice that baby Bellatrix has her father Cygnus's dark features and her mother Druella's sharp eyes, a combination that her nursemaid privately thinks looks rather like a beautiful storm deciding which direction to destroy first. Scholars continue to debate whether the intensity visible even in her infant gaze represented inherent magical power or early signs of the instability that would later define her, and you find yourself leaning closer to the cradle, searching for answers in those dark, unblinking eyes. There exists a peculiar record, you discover, in the marginalia of an old pureblood family registry, suggesting that the Black family once attempted to breed their children for specific magical talents the way Victorian dog breeders refine their terriers, a fringe historical tidbit that makes you wonder if anyone ever told little Bellatrix she was meant to be a weapon long before she was meant to be a person. You pull back from the cradle as the nursemaid lifts the child, and you notice that even now, even at this tender age, Bellatrix does not cry for comfort. She cries, quite clearly, because she is furious that the world dared exist without consulting her first. Welcome to the beginning, you think, though beginning feels like the wrong word for something that was always going to end in flames. You follow the years as they unspool like ribbon from a particularly vindictive gift, watching Bellatrix Black grow from an angry infant into an angry toddler, into an angry child with an impressive vocabulary for expressing that anger in increasingly creative ways. And you begin to understand that the House of Black raises its daughters the way a blacksmith forges a blade, with heat, with pressure, and with absolutely no concern for whether the blade might someday be used against the smith himself. The nursery in Grimmauld Place, where you spend considerable time observing the Black sisters, operates on rules that would make a Victorian governess weep with either recognition or horror, depending on her disposition. Children are seen primarily at formal occasions, heard never, and loved in the abstract way one might love a particularly valuable painting that will someday increase the family's prestige. You watch 7-year-old Bellatrix torture a garden gnome, not with magic, but with the sophisticated cruelty of a child who has learned that power flows to those willing to use it without hesitation, and you think perhaps someone should have intervened right about then. But intervention was not really the Black family's style. They were more of a pretend not to notice until it becomes useful sort of dynasty. Just as the British Empire in the 1950s was beginning its slow, reluctant contraction from global dominance, the old pureblood families were similarly refusing to acknowledge that their era of unchallenged supremacy might be ending, which represents a mainstream historical parallel you find darkly amusing. Bellatrix's childhood, you realize, unfolds during the precise historical moment when magical Britain might have reformed itself, might have opened its arms to change, but instead chose to dig its heels deeper into traditions that would eventually birth a Dark Lord. The fringe historical tidbit you uncover here involves a rumor that the Black family's house elf breeding program was considered groundbreaking in certain circles, which tells you everything you need to know about those circles. Scholars remain divided on whether Bellatrix's childhood cruelty was symptom or cause, nature or nurture, though you suspect the answer, like most answers about human darkness, lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle. Her sisters, Andromeda and Narcissa, orbit her like moons around a particularly unstable planet, and you watch all three of them learning the same lessons, absorbing the same poison, though only one will swallow it completely. Even here, in these early years, you can see the fork in the road approaching. One sister will choose love over legacy, one will choose survival over principle, and Bellatrix, poor, brilliant, terrible Bellatrix, will choose something else entirely, something that looks remarkably like choosing herself right off a cliff. You settle into the worn velvet seats of the Hogwarts Express on September 1st, 1962, watching 11-year-old Bellatrix Black press her face against the window, with an expression that manages to combine excitement, contempt, and the casual certainty that everyone around her exists primarily as supporting characters in her personal epic, and you think that some children simply arrive in this world already certain of their starring role. The steam from the Scarlet engine curls past the windows like ghosts playing chase, and you observe how even at this age, Bellatrix commands the compartment she has claimed, her sisters flanking her like courtiers, attending a very short queen, who hasn't yet learned that crowns must occasionally be shared. The other first years give her a wide berth, sensing with that animal instinct children possess that this particular girl bites first and apologizes never, a skill she will refine considerably over the coming decades, until apologies become so foreign to her vocabulary that she might as well be speaking Parseltongue. You drift alongside her as she steps onto the platform at Hogsmeade, the castle rising above the lake like a promise or a threat depending entirely on what you came here seeking, and Bellatrix, you note with something approaching admiration for her consistency, immediately begins calculating how to use this place rather than how to enjoy it. The Sorting Hat, that ancient and mildly sarcastic artifact of Hogwarts' founding, barely grazes her dark curls before bellowing Slytherin, with what you imagine was either relief or resignation, because sorting Bellatrix Black was rather like sorting fire into the warm things category. Technically accurate, but missing several important points. British boarding school traditions, you recall, stretch back to the medieval period when wealthy families sent their children away to be educated alongside the children of other wealthy families, theoretically learning academics, but more realistically learning the intricate social choreography of privilege. And Hogwarts, despite its magical nature, follows this pattern with remarkable fidelity. You watch Bellatrix navigate her first feast in the Great Hall, her eyes tracking the head table with the intensity of a predator memorizing the territory, noting which professors seem powerful, which seem weak, which might be useful, and which are merely obstacles dressed in academic robes. She makes her first real friend that night, if friend is even the correct word for what Bellatrix Black collects. She meets Rodolphus Lestrange, a boy 2 years her senior with a jaw like a shovel and the emotional range of a moderately complex turnip. But his family is ancient, his blood is pure, and his willingness to follow orders without inconvenient questions makes him perfect for her purposes. The Slytherin common room, green-lit and underwater, becomes her kingdom within weeks, and you observe how quickly she learns which levers to pull, which alliances to forge, which enemies to crush, and which to keep intact for later crushing when the timing proves more advantageous. There exists a curious document in the Hogwarts archives you discover, a disciplinary record from 1963 that was mysteriously erased, but whose existence is confirmed by references in other records. A fringe historical tidbit that suggests Bellatrix's early experiments with dark magic were known to the faculty, but handled with the discretion afforded to wealthy pureblood families, which is to say, not handled at all. Scholars debate whether Hogwarts' house system, with its emphasis on sorting children into categories at age 11, creates the very divisions it claims merely to reflect, and watching Bellatrix thrive in Slytherin's competitive atmosphere makes you think the scholars might have a point. Her academic performance, you note with some surprise, is exceptional. Not because she loves learning, but because she refuses to be second at anything, ever. Even subjects she finds tedious, even courses taught by professors she despises, with the special contempt she reserves for those who possess authority, she has not yet figured out how to steal. You attend her classes invisibly, watching her master spells meant for older students, watching her charm teachers who should know better, watching her build a reputation as the most promising young witch of her generation, which is rather like being the most promising young flame in a fireworks factory. Impressive, right up until the moment everything explodes. Quidditch does not interest her, you notice, because Quidditch involves teamwork and following rules and allowing the possibility that someone else might score the winning points. And Bellatrix has never been particularly skilled at sharing glory. She does, however, attend every match, using the distraction of cheering crowds to practice spells in empty corridors, to explore forbidden sections of the library, to cultivate relationships with the portraits who have been observing Hogwarts politics for centuries, and who, she correctly intuits, know secrets worth trading for. The mainstream historical fact you encounter here involves the British education system of the 1960s, which was undergoing significant transformation as comprehensive schools began replacing the old grammar school system, democratizing education in ways that made traditionalists uncomfortable. A parallel to the magical world's own anxieties about Muggle-born students diluting what purebloods considered their birthright. Bellatrix writes home regularly, letters full of accomplishments and subtle complaints about the quality of her classmates, and you read over her shoulder as she crafts each sentence like a spell, designed to maintain her parents' approval, while positioning herself for the future she is already building. Her OWL examinations arrive when she is 15, and she achieves outstanding in every subject except history of magic, where she receives and exceeds expectations that irritates her so thoroughly she spends the following summer developing her own more accurate version of magical history, a version that, unsurprisingly, places pureblood families at the center of every achievement and Muggleborns at the root of every problem. You watch her return for her 6th and 7th years, watching her transform from a promising student into something else entirely, something harder and more dangerous, and you begin to hear whispers in the common room about a wizard gathering followers, a wizard who shares Bellatrix's views on blood purity, a wizard whose name some students are already afraid to speak. Her NEWT examinations arrive, and she achieves results that should have opened every door in Wizarding Britain, results that should have launched a brilliant career in any field she chose. But you already know she has chosen her field, and it is not a field anyone lists on a career counseling form. She graduates from Hogwarts in 1969, the same year Muggles land on the moon, and you think about how strange it is that humanity reached for the stars in the same moment Bellatrix Black began her descent into the darkest corners of human nature. You stand in the ballroom of Lestrange Manor on a winter evening in 1969, watching chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, polished so thoroughly they reflect the faces of the dancers like a second, darker party happening just beneath everyone's feet. And you realize that pureblood society operates on rules so elaborate and so deliberately obscure that outsiders could spend decades learning them without ever fully understanding why any of it matters. Bellatrix Black, now 18 and technically eligible for the marriage market that constitutes most pureblood women's primary career path, moves through the crowd like a shark through a school of particularly fancy fish. And you notice that, unlike the other young witches who giggle and blush and pretend not to notice the young wizards pretending not to notice them, Bellatrix watches everyone with the calculating gaze of someone shopping for tools rather than romantic partners. The decorations for this particular ball, you observe, include live fairies trapped in crystal cages, their tiny wings beating against the glass in a rhythm that strikes you as rather metaphorical for the young women in attendance, all dressed in their finest and trying not to look too obviously desperate for the favorable matches their families expect them to secure. Rodolphus Lestrange, now a young man of 20 with all the charm and personality of a decorative suit of armor, has already made his intentions regarding Bellatrix abundantly clear, which saves everyone the trouble of the usual courtship dance, while simultaneously eliminating any romance from the equation, though romance, you quickly understand, was never really part of the Black family's vocabulary except as a cautionary tale about what happens to witches who choose love over lineage. The British aristocracy has conducted arranged marriages for centuries, you recall, with young people traded between families like chess pieces in games whose stakes involved land, titles, and political alliances rather than anything so gauche as personal happiness, and the pure-blood wizarding families have simply continued this tradition with magical flourishes. You watch Bellatrix dance with Rodolphus, her movements technically perfect but entirely devoid of warmth, and you think that she has already learned to treat her own body as a performance rather than a home. A skill that will serve her well in the years to come, though perhaps serve is too gentle a word for what she will do. The engagement is announced that evening, to applause that sounds genuine only because everyone present has been practicing applauding appropriately since childhood, and you observe the complex web of congratulations and barely concealed envy that follows as other families calculate what this alliance means for their own positions in the endless pureblood hierarchy. There exists a peculiar tradition, you discover, documented in obscure wedding planning guides from the period, wherein pureblood brides were expected to submit to a magical examination confirming their blood purity. A fringe historical tidbit that makes you wonder whether any tradition, no matter how invasive, could be questioned when questioning itself was considered the real betrayal. Scholars continue to debate whether Bellatrix ever loved Rodolphus, with some interpreting her later behavior as evidence of indifference and others arguing that her capacity for love had simply been redirected toward a more compelling target. And you suspect the truth involves Bellatrix not knowing what love meant well enough to recognize whether she felt it. You follow her through the months of wedding preparation, watching her mother fuss over dress fittings, while Bellatrix stares out windows with an expression that suggests she is present in body only, her mind already traveling toward darker territories that wedding planners did not include in their portfolios. The guest list for the wedding reads like a census of British pureblood society, with families whose feuds stretch back generations agreeing to occupy the same room because refusing an invitation to a Black Lestrange wedding would be a political statement no one wants to make in the current climate. You attend the ceremony invisibly, watching Bellatrix speak her vows with perfect diction and absolutely no emotion, watching Rodolphus look at her with something that might be love, or might simply be the satisfaction of acquiring a particularly valuable object, watching the guests smile and nod and wonder privately whether this marriage will produce the powerful heirs both families are expecting. The reception features entertainment that would horrify Muggles and mildly concern several of the more moderate guests. You notice a few uncomfortable glances when the house elves are made to perform tricks that blur the line between service and humiliation. But no one says anything because saying something would be rude, and rudeness is the only sin pureblood society reliably punishes. Bellatrix. Now Bellatrix Lestrange, in a world where women's names change with their marital status, like clothing changed with the seasons, receives her wedding gifts with the enthusiasm of someone accepting a participation trophy, though you notice her eyes light up when she unwraps a set of ancient books from an anonymous donor whose handwriting you will later learn to recognize. The Victorian era established many of the wedding traditions still practiced in both Muggle and magical Britain, you recall, from white dresses symbolizing purity to elaborate receptions designed to display family wealth. And watching Bellatrix's wedding makes you think that some traditions persist, not because they mean anything, but because people have forgotten how to imagine alternatives. You observe the newlyweds depart for a honeymoon that neither seems particularly excited about, traveling to France where the Lestrange family maintains a chateau that has been in the family since before the French Revolution, which, you note, the family still holds a grudge about, as if centuries were not enough time to get over a little redistributive justice. The marriage settles into patterns quickly, with Rodolphus running the family estates and Bellatrix running essentially everything else, including Rodolphus, who follows her lead with the devoted confusion of a large dog who doesn't quite understand the game but is happy to be included. You begin to hear more whispers now, louder and more frequent, about the wizard calling himself Lord Voldemort, about his gathering of followers, about his promises to restore pure blood supremacy to a magical world that he claims has lost its way, and you notice how Bellatrix's attention sharpens whenever his name is mentioned. Her sisters' lives diverge from hers during this period. Andromeda, the middle sister, has committed the unforgivable sin of falling in love with a Muggle-born wizard named Ted Tonks, and you watch Bellatrix burn Andromeda's face off the family tapestry with a satisfaction that suggests this betrayal has given her something she needed: a target, an enemy, a reason to feel righteous in her increasingly extreme views. Narcissa, the youngest, takes the safer path, marrying Lucius Malfoy in a ceremony that manages to be even more elaborate than Bellatrix's, and you observe the sisters standing side by side at the reception, one blazing with barely contained fury, and one cool as porcelain, united in their contempt for the sister who chose love over legacy. The fringe historical tidbit you encounter during this period involves a rumor that certain pureblood families maintained secret genealogical records, tracking which families had tainted their bloodlines, records that would later be used to create target lists. Though scholars debate whether these records actually existed or simply became convenient myths after the fact. You watch Bellatrix's marriage continue without producing the expected heirs. A failure that would devastate most pureblood wives, but that Bellatrix treats with something approaching relief, and you begin to understand that she has never wanted to be a mother, has never wanted to divide her attention from the singular purpose she is slowly moving toward. The year 1970 arrives, and with it the formal beginning of what historians will call the First Wizarding War, and you watch Bellatrix Lestrange finally find what she has been looking for her entire life. A master worthy of her devotion, a cause worthy of her cruelty, and a war that will let her become the monster she has always suspected she was meant to be. You enter the dim candlelight of a private chamber, where kneeling figures in dark robes surround a wizard whose presence fills the room like smoke-filling lungs, and you understand immediately why Bellatrix Lestrange has finally found something she is willing to bow before, because Lord Voldemort is not a person so much as an event. A gravitational force that bends everything around him toward his particular vision of the world. The initiation ceremony you witness occurs sometime in 1970, in a location so heavily warded that even your narrative presence feels like trespassing, and you watch Bellatrix extend her left forearm with an eagerness that other initiates mask behind solemn expressions, offering her skin to the dark mark the way a lover offers a kiss. The pain of receiving the mark, you gather from the way her body stiffens and her breath catches, is considerable. But Bellatrix's face breaks into something that looks disturbingly like joy, as if the burning in her arm confirms what she has always suspected about herself, that she was made for this, built for this, born for this moment when all her capacity for devotion finally finds a worthy recipient. Rodolphus receives his mark in the same ceremony, though you notice that his expression shows only determination where Bellatrix shows transcendence, and you begin to understand that this marriage has just become considerably more complicated because Bellatrix has found a relationship that makes her actual marriage look like a pale rehearsal for the real thing. The room holds perhaps 30 people, you estimate, though counting them feels somehow dangerous, like counting predators in a dark room and realizing you've become prey. Voldemort speaks in a voice that wraps around its listeners like a spell, promising restoration, promising revenge, promising a world where the proper order is finally enforced, and you watch Bellatrix drink in every word with the desperation of someone who has been thirsty their entire life without knowing what for. The mainstream historical fact you encounter here involves the political violence that plagued Northern Ireland during this same period, commonly called the Troubles, where ideological commitments drove ordinary people to extraordinary acts of cruelty in service of causes they believed were worth any cost. A parallel that suggests something uncomfortable about how easily humans form groups defined by whom they hate. You follow Bellatrix through her first months as a Death Eater, watching her prove herself with an enthusiasm that even the Dark Lord finds noteworthy, and you understand that she has been waiting her entire life for permission to be exactly as cruel as she always wanted to be. The missions she undertakes in these early days involve intimidation more than murder, teaching lessons to wizards and witches who have spoken against pureblood supremacy, reminding the magical world that there are consequences for stepping out of line. And Bellatrix, you observe, excels at teaching lessons in ways that leave permanent impressions. Her marriage to Rodolphus continues in a strange parallel track to her devotion to Voldemort, and you watch the couple operate as partners in violence if nothing else, their shared commitment to the cause providing more intimacy than their wedding vows ever did. The Lestrange brothers, Rodolphus and his younger sibling Rabastan, become her regular companions on missions, a trio that develops a reputation for efficiency and brutality that makes other Death Eaters treat them with wary respect. You attend Death Eater meetings where Voldemort outlines his vision for magical Britain, watching Bellatrix hang on every word while around her other followers calculate angles and wonder about their place in the coming hierarchy. And you think that pure faith, for all its dangers, at least has the virtue of simplicity. The scholars debate endlessly about when Voldemort first created a Horcrux, and watching his interactions with his followers makes you wonder if he was ever fully human enough to understand what he was sacrificing, or whether, like Bellatrix in her own way, he simply found murder more natural than love. There exists a rumor, documented only in the most paranoid corners of magical history, that Voldemort specifically recruited followers with psychological profiles suggesting susceptibility to manipulation, a fringe historical tidbit that would make the Death Eaters victims of a sort, though you find this interpretation difficult to maintain while watching Bellatrix Cruciatus, a shopkeeper who displayed a Muggle Rights poster in his window. The war escalates throughout the early 1970s, and you watch Bellatrix rise through the ranks of Death Eaters with the same driven intensity she once applied to academic achievement, though the metrics for success are considerably darker now. Her parents died during this period, Cygnus and Druella Black, whose rigid commitment to blood purity helped create the daughter who now enacts that ideology through violence. And you observe Bellatrix attend their funerals with dry eyes and a mind clearly elsewhere, already planning her next mission. The magical world, you realize, is tearing itself apart, with the Daily Prophet carrying news of disappearances and the Ministry issuing increasingly desperate reassurances, and ordinary witches and wizards wondering if leaving Britain might be preferable to watching it burn. Bellatrix does not wonder such things, because Bellatrix is one of the people holding the matches, and she has never felt more alive than she does in these years of chaos and purpose. You watch her dual Order of the Phoenix members, watch her torture those deemed blood traitors, watch her become exactly the weapon the Black family always intended to create, though perhaps even they would blanch at how effectively their training has taken hold. The relationship between Bellatrix and Voldemort, you observe carefully, operates on levels that defy simple categorization. She is disciple and servant and something almost romantic, though Voldemort seems incapable of reciprocating any emotion beyond tactical appreciation for her usefulness. Other Death Eaters notice her fervor and respond with mixtures of admiration, envy, and concern, recognizing that her commitment makes her both extremely valuable and potentially dangerous if that commitment ever wavered. Though wavering, you note, seems as foreign to Bellatrix's character as mercy or doubt. The mainstream historical fact intruding here involves the cult psychology that researchers were beginning to document in the 1970s, studying how charismatic leaders exploit followers' needs for meaning and belonging, and watching Bellatrix worship at Voldemort's feet makes you think those researchers would find her a fascinating and terrifying case study. Her marriage to Rodolphus continues to produce no children, a fact that might distress other pureblood families, but that the Lestranges seem to accept with unusual equanimity, perhaps understanding that Bellatrix's true devotion is directed elsewhere and that competing with it would be futile. You linger in shadowed corners of Lestrange Manor, watching the couple interact in the rare moments between missions, and you see something that might be affection, or might simply be the comfort of familiar alliance, though distinguishing between them in such a relationship proves impossible. The years between 1970 and 1981 blur into a montage of violence and purpose, and you watch Bellatrix Lestrange become not just a Death Eater, but the Death Eater, the one whose name makes Order members flinch, the one whose reputation suggests that survival in her presence requires either exceptional luck or the particular mercy of immediate death rather than prolonged suffering. The night approaches when everything changes. When a prophecy and a baby and a mother's love combine to do what all the Wizarding World's defenders could not, and you watch Bellatrix operate in happy ignorance of what is coming, secure in the knowledge that her master is immortal, that their cause is righteous, and that the war she loves will never end. You stand in the ruins of Godric's Hollow on November 1st, 1981, watching Bellatrix Lestrange process the news that Lord Voldemort has vanished, has been destroyed, has somehow fallen to an infant named Harry Potter, and you observe her face cycle through expressions of disbelief, rage, grief, and finally a terrible determination that suggests the story is far from over in her mind. The celebrations happening throughout magical Britain tonight feel like salt in wounds she didn't know she had, and you watch her move through crowds of cheering witches and wizards with the controlled fury of someone planning retribution before they've even finished mourning. Rodolphus stands beside her, steady as always, and you see the couple exchange glances that communicate without words. They know what they need to do, they know that their master cannot truly be gone, and they know that someone, somewhere, must have information about where he has fled. The other Death Eaters are scattering like roaches when the lights come on, you observe, some claiming to have been under the Imperius curse, others fleeing the country, still others attempting to blend back into respectable society, as if they hadn't spent the past decade torturing their neighbors. Bellatrix watches this cowardice with contempt so profound it seems to radiate from her like heat, and you understand that she considers loyalty the highest virtue precisely because she has never experienced any loyalty that wasn't conditional on something. The Lestranges and Barty Crouch Jr., a recent recruit whose father's position in the ministry makes him simultaneously more surprising and more valuable, begin to plan their mission. They will find the Longbottoms, an Auror couple known to have worked closely with Dumbledore and the Order, and they will extract information about where their master has gone. The mainstream historical fact circling this moment involves the show trials and denunciations that follow the collapse of totalitarian regimes throughout history, from Vichy France to the Eastern Bloc, where ordinary people who collaborated with terrible systems suddenly discover convenient new narratives about their involvement. You follow the small group as they approach the Longbottom home on an evening when the air is cold enough to see your breath, and you realize that what is about to happen will define Bellatrix Lestrange more completely than anything she has done before, not because it is her worst crime, but because it is the one for which she will be remembered. Frank and Alice Longbottom are home when the Death Eaters arrive, their infant son Neville sleeping in a crib upstairs, and you watch the couple fight with the desperate courage of people who know exactly what they are facing and have decided that surrender is not an option. The duel is violent, but brief, you observe, the 4 Death Eaters overwhelming the 2 Aurors through sheer numbers, and soon the Longbottoms are bound and helpless and facing the kind of interrogation that makes death seem like a privilege. Bellatrix leads the questioning, if questioning is even the right word for what follows, because her use of the Cruciatus curse goes beyond any attempt to extract information and enters the territory of pure sadism, of pain inflicted for its own sake, of power exercised because it can be. The scholars debate whether the Longbottom torture represents the logical endpoint of Death Eater ideology or a personal pathology specific to Bellatrix, and watching her face as she works suggests that the answer might be both, that her ideology gave her permission and her psychology provided the enthusiasm. You hear her demand information about Voldemort's whereabouts, hear the Longbottoms' screamed refusals, hear the curse words spoken again and again until the screaming stops meaning anything and becomes just sound, just proof of her power over their bodies if not their wills. The torture continues long past any practical purpose, you observe with mounting horror, continues until Frank and Alice Longbottom are no longer capable of giving information even if they wanted to, continues until their minds have broken in ways that magic cannot mend. There exists a fringe historical tidbit, documented in classified ministry records that were never meant to be discovered, suggesting that healers later concluded the Longbottoms might have recovered from shorter exposure to the Cruciatus curse, that the permanence of their condition was not inevitable, but deliberately inflicted, a choice Bellatrix made when she decided to continue long after any useful purpose had passed. You watch the Death Eaters realize that their victims have nothing to give, that Voldemort's location will not be revealed tonight, and you see Bellatrix's fury that even this level of suffering has not produced the answers she needs. The group flees before Aurors arrive, but they are careless in their anger, and their trail is not difficult to follow, and within days they are apprehended, tried, and sentenced to Azkaban for crimes that make even veteran Wizengamot members pale. Bellatrix's trial is a spectacle you attend invisibly, watching her stand before the court and proudly claim her crimes, watching her declare that the Dark Lord will return and reward those who remained faithful, watching the spectators recoil from her fervor as they might recoil from a disease. Barty Crouch Jr.'s father, you note with grim irony, sits on the panel that sentences his own son, his face a mask of professional composure that cannot quite hide the devastation beneath, and you think about how ideology can divide even blood, can turn families into strangers, and love into something that has to be hidden. The Dementors arrive to escort the prisoners to Azkaban, and you watch Bellatrix walk toward them without the fear that makes other prisoners stumble, her head held high as if she is marching to victory rather than life imprisonment. The Longbottoms, you later learn, will spend the rest of their lives in the permanent ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, visited by a son who grew up without knowing the parents whose minds were destroyed because Bellatrix Lestrange wanted answers they never had. You linger in the empty courtroom after the trials conclude, watching the spectators file out and the officials gather their papers, and you think about how a single night's cruelty can echo through decades, can shape the lives of people who weren't even present, can create wounds that never fully heal. The mainstream historical fact you encounter here involves the lasting trauma experienced by torture survivors and their families, documented extensively in human rights research, which suggests that what happened to the Longbottoms was not unusual in kind, only in cause, that humans have always found ways to break each other, magic or no magic. Bellatrix enters Azkaban as prisoner 93, assigned to a high-security cell surrounded by the creatures that feed on human happiness, and you watch her settle into the space that will be her home for the next 14 years, still certain that this imprisonment is temporary, still certain that her master will return, still certain that Faith will be rewarded with freedom. The years stretch ahead like the stone corridor that leads to her cell, and you follow her into the darkness, knowing that the story continues even when the prison walls close in. You drift through the walls of Azkaban Fortress, a structure so saturated with despair that even the stones seem to weep, and you find Bellatrix Lestrange in her cell, her back straight and her eyes fixed on a point only she can see, and you realize that the Dementors circling this prison have found in her a puzzle they cannot quite solve. The creatures that guard magical Britain's worst criminals feed on happiness, on hope, on all the warm human emotions that make life bearable. But Bellatrix's devotion to Voldemort is not exactly happiness. It is something harder, something colder, something the Dementors can taste but not fully consume, like trying to drink from a cup that refills as fast as it is emptied. The other prisoners, you observe, do not fare as well. Within months of arrival, most have retreated into catatonia or madness, their minds choosing escape through dissolution when physical escape proves impossible. Bellatrix watches them break from behind her cell bars, her expression combining contempt for their weakness with something that might almost be curiosity about the mechanics of their collapse. And you think she is conducting her own private research project on human durability. The year 1982 becomes 1983, becomes 1984, and you track the seasons by the changing quality of light that barely penetrates the high prison windows, by the shifts in what little food the prisoners receive, by the rhythms of guard patrols that mark time in the absence of any other markers. She talks to herself, you notice, or perhaps to Voldemort, conducting one-sided conversations with a master she believes is merely temporarily absent, and you wonder whether this counts as madness or as the particular sanity of absolute faith that others simply cannot recognize. The mainstream historical fact you encounter during these years involves the psychology of political prisoners, studied extensively in the 20th century, which suggests that those who maintain ideological commitment often fare better in confinement than those imprisoned for personal crimes. That believing in something larger than yourself provides a framework for survival even in impossible conditions. Bellatrix's framework involves regular affirmations of her faith, regular denunciations of those who betrayed the cause, regular promises to the darkness that she will serve again when her master returns, and you watch her create ritual from repetition the way other prisoners might create madness. The Dementors, you observe, visit her cell frequently, drawn perhaps by the intensity of her emotional state even if they cannot fully feed on its particular flavor, and Bellatrix greets them with a smile that might be insanity or might simply be the particular expression of someone who has made peace with horror by becoming horror's enthusiastic participant. Other Death Eaters share Azkaban with her, Rodolphus in his own cell somewhere in the fortress, Rabastan in another, various lesser followers scattered throughout. But communication between prisoners is forbidden and largely impossible, leaving Bellatrix alone with her thoughts and her faith and the endless cold that seeps through stone walls. The scholars who later examine this period debate whether solitary confinement damages all humans equally or whether certain personality types are more resilient to its effects. And watching Bellatrix thrive where others wither makes you think she might represent a disturbing data point on the side of resilience. There exists a record, you discover, in the hidden archives of Azkaban's administration, documenting the guard's observations of prisoner 93 with unusual detail, a fringe historical tidbit suggesting that even those who watched prisoners for a living found Bellatrix uniquely unsettling, her refusal to break somehow more disturbing than the breaking they typically witnessed. You follow the years as they accumulate like dust in corners, watching Bellatrix age in ways that have more to do with the Dementor's proximity than with natural time. Her face growing gaunt, her hair losing its careful maintenance, her body thinning until she looks like a sketch of herself drawn by someone who remembered only the essential lines. Her husband Rodolphus, you learn through prison records, communicates with her occasionally through bribed guards who pass notes written in coded language, and you read these exchanges with something approaching pity for their awkward attempts at intimacy between people who were never truly intimate even when free. The notes are mostly tactical, affirmations of continued loyalty, speculation about when and how rescue might come, reminders that faith will be rewarded, but occasionally something more personal slips through. A reference to a shared memory, an acknowledgement that even their cold alliance is preferable to total solitude. Bellatrix's physical condition deteriorates with the years, you observe, but her mental state seems almost to improve, sharpening under pressure the way certain metals become harder when hammered, and you begin to understand that she is not merely surviving Azkaban, but somehow using it, transforming her imprisonment into fuel for the hatred that keeps her alive. The prison experiences occasional disruptions during these years, a riot in 1986 that Bellatrix does not join, preferring to preserve her strength, and an escape attempt in 1990 that fails spectacularly and results in increased security. But mostly, the time passes in the numbing sameness that makes prison time both endless and somehow instant. You watch her receive news from the outside world through guards who gossip carelessly and through the occasional newspaper that prisoners are allowed as a privilege, and you see her reactions to reports about Harry Potter, the boy who lived, growing up somewhere in Britain as a constant reminder of her master's defeat. The anger that flashes across her face when Potter is mentioned could light fires, you think, and you suspect she has added him to the list of people she will destroy when freedom finally comes. The 1990s arrive, and with them increasing rumors that something is changing in the magical world, that the peace following Voldemort's fall might not be as permanent as everyone assumed, and you watch Bellatrix's hope, if hope is the right word for something so wrapped in blood and vengeance, grow stronger with each whispered suggestion that her faith might finally be validated. Her sisters' lives continue outside the prison walls, you note, with Narcissa raising a son named Draco and Andromeda raising a daughter named Nymphadora, and you think about how the same bloodline can produce such different outcomes depending on which choices each woman made along the way. Bellatrix knows about Narcissa's son through the family connections that pure blood society maintains even across prison walls, and you sense her approval of her nephew's blood status, if not her particular interest in him as a person. Children have never interested Bellatrix except as potential tools or obstacles. The year 1995 brings news that makes Bellatrix's eyes burn with an intensity the Dementors have never quite extinguished. Harry Potter has claimed that Lord Voldemort has returned, has been reborn through dark magic, has risen from whatever existence he occupied during the years of his absence. The Ministry denies it, the Daily Prophet mocks it, the wizarding world refuses to believe it, but Bellatrix knows with the certainty of absolute faith that her master has returned for her, that her years of loyalty will finally be rewarded, that the moment she has been waiting for is approaching at last. The mainstream historical fact you encounter here involves the psychology of hope in prisoners, extensively documented in concentration camp survivors and political detainees, which suggests that the anticipation of liberation can be almost as powerful as liberation itself, that simply believing rescue is possible changes the neurochemistry of waiting. You watch the months following Voldemort's return unfold, watching Bellatrix's patience finally tested by the knowledge that he is free while she remains caged, watching her wonder when he will come for her, watching her faith face its final examination. The breakout happens in January 1996, orchestrated by the Dark Lord himself with the help of Dementors, who have apparently switched their allegiance from the Ministry to someone who better appreciates their particular gifts. And you watch Bellatrix Lestrange walk out of Azkaban prison after 14 years with a smile that suggests every moment of suffering was worth this single instant of vindication. The magical world, which had reluctantly begun to accept that Voldemort might have returned, can no longer deny the reality of 10 escaped Death Eaters appearing in the Daily Prophet like a nightmare-made newspaper print, and you sense the fear spreading through Britain like cold water through cracks in stone. Bellatrix emerges from prison changed in body but unchanged in purpose, her devotion to Voldemort now hardened by over a decade of suffering into something that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be diminished, cannot be defeated by anything less than death itself, and perhaps not even then. You follow Bellatrix Lestrange through the months following her escape from Azkaban, watching her reintegrate into Voldemort's service with the fervor of a zealot returning to the temple after exile, and you notice that prison has, if anything, intensified the qualities that made her dangerous before. Her cruelty has become purer, her devotion more absolute, her patience worn down to nothing but appetite for violence. The Death Eaters, who maintained their freedom during the years of her imprisonment, treat her with mixtures of respect and wariness, recognizing that her 14 years of suffering for the cause gives her a moral authority among the faithful that their comfortable accommodations with the post-Voldemort world cannot match. Lucius Malfoy, you observe with some amusement, seems particularly uncomfortable around his sister-in-law, perhaps because his years of pretending the Imperious Curse made him do it contrast so sharply with Bellatrix's proud acceptance of Azkaban as the price of loyalty. The reunion with Rodolphus happens quietly, you note, the couple acknowledging each other's survival without the drama that might characterize other reunions, and you sense that whatever bond they share has actually strengthened through shared suffering, even as romantic love remains entirely absent from the equation. Narcissa hovers at the edges of Bellatrix's return, clearly relieved to have her sister back, but also clearly anxious about what Bellatrix's presence means for her family's position in the coming war, and you watch the two women navigate a relationship complicated by years of separation and fundamentally different approaches to survival. The Dark Lord himself receives Bellatrix with what, for him, constitutes warmth, a brief acknowledgement of her loyalty, a restoration of her position in his inner circle, a promise that her suffering will be remembered and rewarded, and you watch her reaction with the fascinated horror of observing someone receive a religious vision. The mainstream historical fact you encounter during this period involves the phenomenon of soldiers returning from prisoner of war camps, documented extensively after World War II, which suggests that reintegration into normal life proves almost as challenging as imprisonment itself, though Bellatrix has no interest in normal life, which perhaps simplifies her transition. Her first mission after returning to active service involves accompanying the Dark Lord to the Ministry of Magic, where a prophecy about Harry Potter and Voldemort is kept in the Department of Mysteries, and you follow the group through the twisting corridors of a building that manages to make bureaucracy genuinely dangerous. The Battle of the Department of Mysteries, as it will later be called, gives Bellatrix her first opportunity to demonstrate that prison has not diminished her dueling skills, and you watch her engage members of the Order of the Phoenix with the particular viciousness of someone who has been waiting 14 years to hurt people again. Sirius Black, you realize with something approaching literary irony, has become one of the Order's members, her own cousin, the family disgrace who rejected everything the Blacks stood for and spent his own years in Azkaban for crimes he didn't commit, now fighting on the opposite side of a battle that feels like a family reunion in the worst possible sense. The duel between Bellatrix and Sirius has a personal quality the other fighting lacks, you observe, both combatants throwing taunts alongside curses, both drawing on decades of family history and resentment and the particular hatred that only blood relatives can generate. The killing curse that ends the duel, not quite a killing curse actually, but a stunning spell that sends Sirius through the veil in the Department of Mysteries, which amounts to the same thing, comes from Bellatrix's wand with an accuracy that suggests she has been waiting her entire life to eliminate this particular stain on the family honor. You watch Sirius fall backward through the ancient archway, his expression surprised even as he disappears into whatever waits beyond, and you see Bellatrix's triumphant laughter echo through the chamber with a joy so complete it borders on the ecstatic. Harry Potter, witnessing his godfather's death, chases Bellatrix through the ministry with a fury that would be admirable if it weren't so obviously exactly what she wants, and you follow the chase through corridors and atria until they reach the grand entrance hall, where their confrontation reaches its climax. The mainstream historical fact intruding here involves the psychology of revenge, extensively studied by researchers who find that anticipation of vengeance activates the brain's reward centers while actual vengeance often leaves a hollow feeling. Though Bellatrix, you suspect, represents an exception to this pattern, her joy at Sirius's death appearing entirely genuine and entirely complete. Harry attempts the Cruciatus curse on Bellatrix, you observe, his grief and rage momentarily overcoming his moral objections, but the curse falters because he means it without truly meaning it, because inflicting suffering for its own sake is simply not in his nature, no matter how much he might want it to be. The scholars debate whether Harry's inability to successfully cast an unforgivable curse represents moral strength or emotional weakness, and watching Bellatrix mock his failure makes you think she would definitely vote for weakness. Voldemort arrives to confront Dumbledore in the Ministry Atrium, and you witness the duel between the two most powerful wizards of their generation, while Bellatrix watches with the devotion of someone witnessing their god walk among mortals. The duel ends inconclusively, Voldemort escaping with Bellatrix at his side. But the Ministry's denial of his return becomes impossible to maintain when the Minister himself witnesses the Dark Lord's presence, and the Second Wizarding War officially begins in the public consciousness, even though it has been underway for months. There exists a peculiar record you discover in the Department of Mystery's own files about the veil through which Sirius fell, a fringe historical tidbit suggesting that the archway has been studied for centuries without anyone definitively determining what lies beyond, leading to theories ranging from simple death to portals to other dimensions to afterlives that wizards have never been able to confirm or deny. You follow Bellatrix through the year that follows, watching her serve the Dark Lord with the tireless dedication that makes her simultaneously his most valuable and most unstable asset, and you observe how the other Death Eaters have learned to work around her particular brand of fanaticism rather than risk confronting it directly. The Malfoy family's fall from favor following Lucius's capture at the Department of Mysteries provides Bellatrix with an opportunity to demonstrate her own continued usefulness while simultaneously enjoying her brother-in-law's humiliation. And you watch her navigate family dynamics with the skill of someone who has always prioritized ideology over blood. Narcissa's desperation to protect her son Draco, tasked with an impossible mission to assassinate Dumbledore, leads her to seek Severus Snape's help in an unbreakable vow that Bellatrix witnesses with visible skepticism. She does not trust Snape, has never trusted Snape, finds his convenient turn to the Dark Lord's side after years of apparent loyalty to Dumbledore entirely too convenient to be credible. The year culminates in the Battle of the Astronomy Tower, where Dumbledore falls to Snape's curse, and you observe Bellatrix's mixed reactions, triumph that the greatest obstacle to her master's victory has been removed, frustration that Snape, rather than she, was the one to accomplish this feat, and continued suspicion that something about the situation doesn't quite add up. The war that follows Dumbledore's death escalates rapidly, you observe, with the Ministry falling to Death Eater control, and Harry Potter becoming the most wanted wizard in Britain, and Bellatrix finding herself in a position of power she has waited decades to achieve. Her role in the new regime involves enforcing the blood purity laws that now govern magical Britain, and you watch her embrace this work with the enthusiasm of someone who has finally seen their deepest beliefs become official policy.
You enter Malfoy Manor on an evening when the chandeliers cast shadows that seem to move with independent purpose. And you find Bellatrix Lestrange presiding over an interrogation that demonstrates just how completely she has come to embody the Dark Lord's will, her wand moving through curses with the practiced grace of someone who has elevated torture to something approaching art form. The prisoners brought before her during these months of Death Eater control include Muggleborns fleeing the new registration requirements, Order members captured in skirmishes, and the occasional blood trader whose family connections might provide intelligence worth extracting, and you observe Bellatrix approach each case with the same methodical cruelty, regardless of what they might actually know. The war has given her everything she ever wanted, you realize? Power over others, the validation of her beliefs, proximity to her beloved master, and yet you notice something in her eyes that might be emptiness. The hollowness of someone who has achieved their goals and discovered that achievement itself is not the same as satisfaction. Rodolphus continues to operate at her side, though their relationship has become even more clearly one of professional partnership rather than personal connection. And you see them coordinate attacks with the efficiency of long practice, even as they barely exchange unnecessary words. The mainstream historical fact you encounter during this period involves the banality of evil, a concept developed by philosopher Hannah Arendt to describe how ordinary people participate in atrocities when those atrocities are normalized by authority. Though Bellatrix represents something different. Not banal evil, but enthusiastic evil. Evil embraced rather than merely followed. The year 1997 passes into 1998, and you watch the war grind toward what feels increasingly like a conclusion, though which side will achieve that conclusion remains uncertain. Harry Potter continues to evade capture, you observe, moving through magical Britain on a mission only he fully understands, and Bellatrix's frustration with his continued existence grows with each failed attempt to locate him. The capture of Potter and his companions at Malfoy Manor provides the opportunity she has been waiting for, and you follow her as she descends upon the prisoners with a glee that makes even the other Death Eaters uncomfortable. The recognition of Hermione Granger as a Muggle-born witch triggers something particularly vicious in Bellatrix, you observe, leading to an interrogation that crosses lines even by her standards. She carves the word mudblood into the girl's arm with a knife, preferring the intimate cruelty of blade to the distance of wand. And you watch this scene with the particular horror of witnessing someone discover new depths in an already bottomless abyss. The escape of the prisoners, aided by the house elf Dobby, who dies in the attempt, enrages Bellatrix beyond reason, and you watch her blame everyone except herself for the failure. The Malfoys for their incompetence, the other Death Eaters for their interference, the universe itself for denying her the satisfaction of delivering Potter to her master, there exists a fringe historical tidbit, documented in the records of wizard-elf relations, suggesting that house elves' ability to apparate through anti-apparition wards was actually discovered by a black family ancestor who tried and failed to prevent it. A detail that would surely increase Bellatrix's fury if she knew, since her own family's research enabled the escape that now haunts her. The scholars debate whether Bellatrix's treatment of Hermione represented a new extreme in her behavior, or simply the logical continuation of patterns established throughout her life. And watching her during this period makes you think the answer matters less than the simple observation that she has become indistinguishable from her worst impulses. The weeks following the prisoner's escape see Bellatrix operate with increasing recklessness, as if the near success has made her desperate for the capture that would redeem her in her master's eyes, and you observe the other Death Eaters giving her even wider berth than usual. Her relationship with Voldemort during this period takes a strange turn, you notice. The Dark Lord seems to trust her with information he withholds from others, seems to treat her as something between lieutenant and confidant, and you wonder whether his Horcrux-damaged soul has finally recognized in her a devotion pure enough to be completely reliable. The revelation that comes to Bellatrix regarding her master's Horcruxes, specifically the cup of Hufflepuff stored in her family vault at Gringotts, fills her with a terror you have never seen in her before. She has been entrusted with something irreplaceable, and the thought that she might fail to protect it haunts her with an intensity that makes her normal cruelty seem almost calm. The vault is impregnable, she assures herself, assures Voldemort, assures anyone who will listen. But you observe the doubt that flickers in her eyes when she thinks no one is watching, the awareness that she has staked everything on a protection that relies on goblin magic rather than her own power. The mainstream historical fact you encounter here involves the psychology of belief under pressure, extensively documented in studies of religious commitment during persecution, which suggests that true believers often become more rather than less devoted when their faith is tested, a pattern that helps explain Bellatrix's escalating fervor as the war enters its final phase. Şunu 100 kelime daha devam ettir, sonra bitir.
As the spring of 1998 approaches, you sense the walls closing in around her certainty. Bellatrix fights at Hogwarts with the desperation of someone defending not a cause, but a self-image that cannot survive defeat. When Molly Weasley strikes her down, it feels less like a heroic victory than the inevitable collapse of a structure built entirely on fanaticism. Watching her fall, you understand that Bellatrix never feared death itself, only irrelevance, only the possibility that her devotion might ultimately mean nothing. In the end, the war takes from her the one thing she truly worshipped, the belief that her loyalty made her special.